The sound of rain against the windows had always made Sarah Hamilton feel a strange mix of comfort and melancholy. But that evening it was just noise, background static to the chaos in her mind. The board meeting had stretched into its third exhausting hour, every new issue pulling her further away from the one place she wanted to be, home with her baby. Ethan was only 6 months old, and already life had become a balancing act between being the CEO of a billion-dollar empire and being his only parent. She had promised herself that he would never feel second to her work, but promises were easy to make and harder to keep when your phone never stopped buzzing. When the meeting finally adjourned, she checked her watch and felt her stomach twist. She was late, much later than Ethan's feeding schedule allowed. As she hurried out, her assistant reminded her she still needed to speak with the head chef about an urgent supply chain issue. Sarah wanted to scream, but she swallowed her frustration, knowing this was the life she had chosen. Still, guilt tugged at her as she clutched Ethan's diaper bag and hurried down the hall toward the kitchen, already hearing his soft cries from where she had left him with a staff member. Except when she walked through the kitchen doors, her breath caught in her throat. The scene before her didn't make sense at first. A tall man stood near the prep counter, his dark hair slightly messy, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbow. In his arms was Ethan, snuggled securely against his chest. The man held a bottle to the baby's mouth, his expression soft and focused, the kind of attention that spoke of quiet familiarity. Ethan, the same child who had been wailing just minutes ago, was now drinking peacefully, his little fingers curled into the man's shirt as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sarah's heart pounded. She didn't know this man. No one had asked her permission. Every muscle in her body tensed with the instinct to snatch Ethan away. But before she could move, something stopped her. The look in the man's eyes. There was no casual detachment there, no hint of discomfort or inconvenience. Instead, there was a warmth that came from somewhere deeper than politeness. It was the look of someone who understood, who remembered. It was so unexpected that it rooted her to the spot. He noticed her then, and a flicker of guilt crossed his face. "I'm sorry," he began quickly, his voice low but steady. "He was crying so hard. One of the waitresses mentioned you were in the meeting room and I thought maybe I could help. My little girl isn't so little anymore. But I remember what this was like." The words hung between them, almost fragile. Sarah studied him carefully. His steady hands, the way he adjusted Ethan slightly to keep him comfortable, the patience in his posture. In a world where she had learned to question everyone's motives, there was something disarming about him. She could have responded with suspicion, could have taken Ethan and retreated into the guarded bubble she had been living in since the day she became a single mother. But instead she heard herself asking, "You have a daughter?" A faint smile touched his lips, and for a brief second she saw something else, an echo of his own past, perhaps tinged with joy and a little pain. "Yeah, she's 8 now. But I used to feed her like this every night when she was a baby. Sometimes at 2 in the morning, sometimes right after I got home from a long shift. You never forget the feeling." Sarah didn't know why, but her chest ached at his words. She thought of the night she had sat alone in the dim light of Ethan's nursery, feeding him with one hand while scrolling through business reports with the other, trying to be everything at once. No one had ever stepped in to share those moments. Not her family. Not friends. Certainly not Ethan's father, who had walked away before he was even born. And now here was this stranger holding her son as if it were second nature, not because he had to, but because he wanted to ease the cries of a child who wasn't even his. For someone like Sarah, whose life had been marked by control and careful distance, this was unsettling. Vulnerability wasn't her language anymore. Independence was her armor. And yet, standing there watching this man soothe her son, she felt something she hadn't expected: relief. It wasn't just about Ethan being fed on time. It was the realization that for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't the only one carrying the weight. Someone else had stepped into that moment, unasked, without expectation of thanks or reward. Someone else had shown care. The kitchen noise hummed softly around them, the clinking of dishes and the faint scent of bread baking in the oven. The rain outside continued to fall, but the storm in Sarah's chest had quieted. She stepped closer, her hands brushing against Ethan's blanket as she gently took him into her arms. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but loaded with meaning. He gave a small nod as if it wasn't a big deal. But Sarah knew better. She knew that kindness like this, offered without an agenda, was rare. And it was in that rare moment that something shifted in her. For months she had believed she had to handle everything alone, that letting someone else help meant losing control. But this felt different. It wasn't about giving up her independence. It was about letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world still held people who could be trusted. Ethan burped softly against her shoulder, his tiny body relaxing into her. Sarah's eyes flicked to the man one last time before she left the kitchen. She didn't even know his name yet. But she knew she wouldn't forget him. Not because of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but because in a moment when she was stretched thin and vulnerable, he had stepped in quietly, offering exactly what was needed. And that, Sarah thought as she held her son close, was something money could never buy. Sarah stood there in the quiet hum of the kitchen, her son resting in her arms, the stranger's presence still lingering in her mind. For so long she had convinced herself that letting anyone else care for Ethan was dangerous, an opening for disappointment or worse, betrayal. She had been burned too many times before. Friends who promised to be there had faded away. Family had judged her choices more than they had supported them. And Ethan's father, well, he had vanished before he could even learn the sound of his own son's cry. Trust had become something Sarah stored in a locked vault, never to be handed out carelessly again. But now, standing with Ethan's small weight against her shoulder, she couldn't ignore what had just happened. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't even thought to ask. And yet, in her absence, a complete stranger had stepped forward, not to replace her, not to judge her, but simply to ease the hunger and the tears of a baby who wasn't his. It wasn't the act of feeding Ethan that unsettled her. It was the gentleness with which he had done it. The way his large hands had held the bottle steady, the way his body had shifted ever so slightly to make sure Ethan's head rested comfortably. Even when he'd realized she was watching, there had been no defensiveness, no arrogance, only a quiet, almost humble explanation. Sarah felt a strange mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Gratitude because she had just witnessed a rare kindness. Discomfort because accepting it meant cracking open the walls she'd built so high around herself. She had lived in survival mode for so long that letting anyone else share even a fraction of the responsibility felt unnatural, even risky. And yet deep inside a voice whispered, maybe it's time. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She finished her conversation with the chef, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the kitchen. She noticed he didn't linger around, didn't wait for thanks or recognition. By the time she came back through the kitchen later, he was clearing his table quietly, his own meal half-eaten. The waitress mentioned he was a single dad himself, there with his daughter, who was waiting in the booth. That tiny piece of information made Sarah pause. A single dad. She didn't know why, but that detail made something click. He wasn't some random stranger who thought he knew better. He wasn't acting out of pity or curiosity. He understood, truly understood, what it meant to be the only parent a child had to rely on. When Sarah glanced toward the dining area, she saw him sitting across from a little girl with curly hair and bright eyes. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the way he leaned forward, listening to her intently as she spoke, occasionally making her laugh. It was the same kind of attention he had given Ethan, not distracted, not rushed, focused, present. Sarah felt a pang in her chest. Presence was something she struggled with. No matter how hard she tried, the demands of her business always seemed to pull her away, even in small moments. She wondered if that was why she was so afraid to let others help, because deep down, she feared they would fail to be truly present for Ethan when he needed it most. And yet, here was proof that someone could. She didn't approach them that night. She told herself she was too busy, that she didn't want to intrude. But the truth was she was processing. Something had shifted in her, and she needed to understand it before she acted. When she got home, Ethan was asleep in her arms, his tiny face relaxed in a way that only came from being well-fed and safe. Sarah sat in the nursery for a long while just watching him breathe. The image of the stranger's steady hands feeding her son replayed in her mind again and again, not in a way that threatened her role as a mother, but in a way that reminded her she didn't have to do every single thing alone. That thought scared her, but it also felt freeing. The next morning, she caught herself wondering about him. What was his name? What had his life been like? How had he ended up raising a daughter on his own? She realized that she wanted to know more, not just because of what he'd done for Ethan, but because there was something undeniably human about the way he carried himself, like someone who had faced his own share of storms and had learned how to move through them without losing his gentleness. For Sarah, this was uncharted territory. Letting someone in, even just in thought, was a risk. But she could feel the walls inside her shifting ever so slightly. That moment in the kitchen had been more than a random act of kindness. It had been a mirror, showing her a version of life where she didn't have to fight every battle alone. Days passed and the memory didn't fade. If anything, it grew clearer. She found herself more aware of how tightly she clung to control, how rarely she accepted help, and how exhausted that habit had made her. Trust, she realized, didn't have to mean giving up her independence. It could mean allowing the right people to stand beside her when she needed it most. She didn't know yet if that man would ever become one of those people. But she knew the first step toward trust had been taken the moment she chose not to snatch Ethan away in panic. The moment she allowed herself to see not a stranger, but a fellow parent who understood the language of sleepless nights and endless care. And in that small but profound shift, Sarah found a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that maybe there were still people in the world she could count on. Hope that Ethan's life could be filled not just with her love, but with the kindness of others who would care for him as she did. It was just one moment. But sometimes, one moment is all it takes to start rewriting the story of a guarded heart. If this story touched your heart, then don't keep it to yourself. Give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little light today, and make sure to subscribe to Everyday Grace Stories so you never miss another moment that reminds us all of the power of kindness.